You ever think about the person sitting next to you in a coffee shop, grading papers with a red pen? The professor who always wore those slightly outdated sweaters and had that gentle smile when students asked for deadline extensions? What if I told you that behind those reading glasses and that stack of essays about American literature, there was someone who spent 12 years living a lie so deep that even his own reflection became a stranger? Imagine waking up every single morning and having to remember which version of yourself you need to be that day. Not just what clothes to wear or what mood to fake, but which entire life story to recall, which childhood memories to reference, which family to miss. Now imagine doing that for over 4,000 days straight, knowing that one single mistake, one wrong detail about a hometown you never lived in could end everything. The reality of deep cover intelligence work is so much more psychologically devastating than any thriller could ever capture, because the real terror isn't in the dramatic moments of near discovery. It's in the slow erosion of knowing who you actually are underneath all the carefully constructed layers. What you're about to hear is the story of Dmitry Volkov, except that wasn't his real name. His real name was Viktor Petrov, and for 12 years, he taught American history and political science at a mid-sized university in the American Midwest, all while serving as an illegal operative for the KGB's elite First Chief Directorate. This wasn't some recent scandal that made headlines. This was during the height of the Cold War, when the stakes were nuclear annihilation, and every piece of intelligence could shift the balance between two superpowers locked in an ideological death grip. The operation was codenamed Mirror, because that's exactly what Dmitry had to become. A perfect reflection of American academic life, so flawless that not even his closest colleagues suspected that the man discussing Tocqueville and Jefferson over faculty lunch had spent his formative years in a secret training facility outside Moscow, learning to become someone else entirely. The man who would become Professor Dmitry Volkov was born Viktor Petrov in 1945 in Leningrad, just as World War II was ending and the Soviet Union was beginning its transformation into a nuclear superpower. His father had been a mid-level official in the Communist Party, his mother a translator who spoke 4 languages fluently. From childhood, Victor showed an unusual aptitude for languages and an almost photographic memory for details, traits that would later make him invaluable to Soviet intelligence. He grew up during the Khrushchev era, in a society that was slightly less paranoid than Stalin's regime, but still fundamentally authoritarian and obsessed with the ideological struggle against Western capitalism. By the time he was 16, Victor had already been identified by KGB talent spotters who regularly screened promising students from good party families. He was recruited into a special program while still in high school, told only that he was being considered for important state work that would require absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty to the Soviet cause. The training that followed was unlike anything depicted in popular spy fiction. Victor spent 3 years at a classified facility known only as School 101, located in the forests outside Moscow. This wasn't a place where they taught you how to kill with a pencil or seduce enemy agents with champagne and charm. This was psychological reconstruction on an industrial scale. Victor and 15 other candidates lived in a fabricated American town, complete with a main street, a diner, a church, even a small movie theater that showed only American films. They were forbidden from speaking Russian. They studied American regional accents, American sports, American television shows, American political debates, American brand preferences, even American dental work, because Soviet dental techniques left distinctive markers that could expose an illegal operative during any medical examination. They learned to think in imperial measurements instead of metric, to instinctively reach for the right side of the road when imagining driving, to cringe at the thought of warm beer the way real Americans did. They memorized entire fictional life histories, complete with childhood friends whose names they had to recall instantly, high school teachers who had supposedly influenced them, family tragedies that explained any gaps or inconsistencies in their legends. Victor's legend, his cover identity, was carefully constructed over 18 months by a team of specialized officers. He became Dmitry Volkov, supposedly born in 1947 in a small town in upstate New York, to Russian immigrant parents who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution. This backstory was crucial because it explained any slight accent or cultural knowledge that might slip through, framing them as the residual influence of his immigrant heritage rather than evidence of his true origins. His fictional parents had died in a car accident when he was 19, a tragedy that served multiple operational purposes. It explained why he had no living relatives that anyone could verify. It gave him a reason for being somewhat reserved and emotionally distant, and it provided a sympathetic narrative that would make American colleagues less likely to probe too deeply into his past. According to his legend, Dmitry had worked his way through college at a state university, earned a master's degree in history, and was now pursuing his doctorate while teaching to support himself. Every element of this story had been verified and backdated into actual records through a network of KGB agents and sympathizers embedded in American institutions. If anyone checked, they would find Dmitry Volkov's birth certificate, his high school transcripts, his college enrollment records, even a few carefully placed mentions in old local newspapers. In 1972, at the age of 27, Viktor Petrov ceased to exist in any official capacity. The man who had been Viktor boarded a flight from Moscow to Vienna, but Dmitry Volkov arrived in New York, entering the United States on a genuine American passport that had been obtained through a deceased infant's identity, a common technique known as a ghost. He carried 2 suitcases containing clothes purchased in America during a previous reconnaissance trip, a few academic books with annotations in English, and a folder of recommendation letters from professors who didn't exist at universities that did. His instructions were simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Establish yourself in American academic life. Build a reputation as a competent but unremarkable teacher. Cultivate relationships with colleagues who had access to sensitive information or connections to military research, and wait for activation orders that might come in months or might come in years. He was what the KGB called a sleeper agent, planted deep with no immediate operational tasking, meant to blend so completely into American society that he would be invisible until the moment Moscow needed him. Dmitry's first position was as a graduate teaching assistant at a large state university in Illinois, a job that required minimal background checking and offered maximum exposure to American academic culture. He taught introductory American history courses to undergraduates, graded papers about the Revolutionary War and Manifest Destiny, attended faculty meetings where professors argued about curriculum changes and parking privileges. He rented a small apartment near campus, bought a used car, joined a local gym, even started attending a Lutheran church occasionally because it was what a man of his supposed background would do. Every interaction was calculated, every friendship carefully calibrated to appear natural while serving operational purposes. He dated occasionally, always choosing women who were not particularly curious about his past, relationships that were pleasant, but never deep enough to require the kind of emotional vulnerability that might expose inconsistencies in his legend. He became exactly what he appeared to be, a quiet, hard-working academic with a slight sadness around the edges, the kind of person people liked, but never quite got close to. The dead drop system through which Dmitri received his instructions was elegant in its simplicity. Once every 6 weeks, he would drive to a public library in a neighboring town, check out a specific book using his library card, and find a microdot message hidden behind the due date card. These messages were usually brief, sometimes just confirmation that Moscow was still monitoring him, occasionally containing requests for specific information about colleagues or students who had been identified as persons of interest. Dmitri would encode his responses using a one-time pad cipher, reduce them to microdots, and leave them in a hollowed-out bolt on a specific park bench during his regular jogging route. The system was designed with multiple layers of deniability. If anyone ever discovered the messages, they would appear to be random marks or printing errors. If Dmitri was ever caught in the act of servicing a dead drop, he could claim he was picking up litter or retying his shoe. The tradecraft was so refined that it was nearly invisible. Just another jogger in a public park, just another library patron, checking out books. By 1976, Dmitri had completed his fabricated doctorate and secured a tenure track position at a smaller university in Ohio, a school with approximately 8,000 students and a reputation for solid but unspectacular academics. This was precisely the target environment Moscow wanted, large enough to offer access to interesting people and information, small enough that a competent professor could become established without attracting too much scrutiny. Dmitri taught courses in American political history, Cold War studies, and comparative government systems. The irony was not lost on him that he was lecturing American students about the dangers of Soviet totalitarianism while secretly serving that very system, describing KGB surveillance methods to undergraduates who had no idea they were learning from someone who used those exact techniques. He published a few moderately respected academic papers, presented at regional conferences, served on departmental committees. He became, in every measurable way, a legitimate member of American academic society. His primary intelligence value during these years was not in stealing classified documents or recruiting spies, but in providing Moscow with deep contextual understanding of American academic and political culture. Dmitri's reports analyzed the mood on American campuses regarding détente, the anti-nuclear movement, debates about military spending, shifting attitudes toward the Soviet Union among young intellectuals. He identified students who expressed anti-American or pro-Soviet sympathies, not for immediate recruitment but for long-term monitoring as they moved into positions of influence in government, media, or academia. He cultivated relationships with professors who had security clearances for consulting work with defense contractors or government agencies, gathering information not through dramatic espionage, but through casual conversations about their work over coffee or at faculty social events. This was intelligence collection at its most patient and sophisticated, building a comprehensive picture of American society from the inside over years and decades, rather than seeking immediate tactical advantages. The psychological cost of this existence was something no amount of training could fully prepare someone for. Dmitri lived in a state of permanent low-level vigilance that eroded his sense of self in ways he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't form genuine friendships because every relationship was instrumentalized, evaluated for its intelligence potential. He couldn't fall in love because love requires vulnerability and honesty that were operationally impossible. He couldn't share his real thoughts about politics or history or life because his real thoughts were formed by a Soviet education and worldview that would immediately expose him as foreign. He developed insomnia, not from fear of discovery, but from the existential exhaustion of maintaining a performance every waking hour. There were moments, usually late at night in his small faculty office, when he would catch himself unsure whether he was Victor pretending to be Dmitri, or whether Dmitri had become real and Victor was just a memory of someone he used to be. The KGB had anticipated this psychological fragmentation and considered it acceptable collateral damage in service of the operation. What mattered was not Dmitri's mental health, but his operational effectiveness, and by that measure, he remained valuable. In 1983, Dmitri achieved tenure, a milestone that represented both professional security and operational success. A tenured professor was virtually immune to casual background checks or employment verification, embedded so deeply in institutional structures that removing him would require extraordinary cause. He had become invisible through sheer normality, the kind of professor students forgot about the semester after taking his class, competent enough to avoid complaints, but not dynamic enough to attract particular attention or scruturation. He had a small circle of faculty friends who considered him pleasant company if somewhat reserved, a handful of former students who remembered him as fair but demanding, a department chair who valued his reliability and willingness to serve on tedious committees. He drove a 7-year-old Toyota, lived in a modest house near campus, spent his summers reading and writing in his backyard. To any observer, Dmitri Volkov was living a quiet, slightly lonely, but fundamentally stable life as a small-town academic. What nobody knew was that Dmitri had been activated for more direct operational work. Through his academic connections, he had identified a colleague in the engineering department who consulted for a defense contractor working on satellite communication systems. This colleague, Professor Michael Brennan, was not being recruited as a spy. He had no idea he was being targeted. Instead, Dmitri cultivated a genuine friendship with him, attending the same gym, joining the same book club, eventually becoming close enough that Brennan would mention his work in casual conversation. Over 18 months, Dmitri learned details about the contractor's security procedures, the general architecture of their satellite systems, the names of key personnel, and the timeline for deploying new technology. None of this information was technically classified at the level Brennan knew it, but aggregated and analyzed by KGB technical specialists in Moscow, it provided valuable intelligence about American military communications capabilities. This was the art of illegal intelligence work, gathering puzzle pieces that were individually innocuous but collectively valuable all while maintaining perfect deniability. The operation ran smoothly until 1984, when a series of KGB defections in other countries prompted the FBI to intensify counterintelligence operations against suspected Soviet illegals in the United States. Dmitry was not specifically targeted, but the increased surveillance meant that patterns which had been invisible for years suddenly came under scrutiny. An FBI analyst reviewing library circulation records as part of a broader pattern analysis noticed that certain books were being checked out with unusual regularity from multiple libraries by different individuals, always for exactly the maximum loan period, always returned precisely on time. This pattern matched known dead drop communication methods. The FBI began monitoring these libraries and the individuals who checked out these specific books. Dmitry's legend was so well constructed that even when his name appeared on the watch list, nothing about his background raised immediate flags. He was exactly who his documents said he was, as far as official records were concerned. But intelligence work is ultimately about patterns and anomalies. And in 1985, something changed. During a routine faculty gathering, Dmitry made a minor mistake that would have been meaningless to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for inconsistencies. A colleague mentioned a classic American television show from the 1950s, asking if anyone remembered a specific episode. Dmitry, responding instinctively to be part of the conversation, described a scene from that episode with perfect detail. The problem was that the show in question had never aired in upstate New York. During the years when Dmitry supposedly lived there, it had been a regional broadcast limited to the West Coast. A normal person wouldn't have known this detail, wouldn't have caught the inconsistency. But one of the faculty members at that gathering was a former Air Force intelligence officer who had transitioned to academic life, and he had been trained to notice exactly these kinds of anomalies. He didn't say anything at the time, but he mentioned it to a friend who still worked in counterintelligence, framing it as an amusing oddity rather than a serious concern. That casual mention triggered a more detailed investigation into Dmitry Volkov's background. The FBI discovered that while all his documents were genuine, there was something uncanny about how perfect they were. Real identities have inconsistencies, gaps, errors in record keeping. Dmitry's paper trail was flawless, which in counterintelligence terms is itself a red flag. They began physical surveillance, watching his movements, monitoring his communications, analyzing his patterns. They observed his regular jogging route, his library visits, his interactions with colleagues. Everything appeared normal, but normal in a way that seemed almost rehearsed. The FBI brought in a linguistic analyst to listen to recordings of Dmitry's speech patterns, looking for any trace of non-native English. The analyst found nothing definitive, but noted that Dmitry's English was perhaps too correct, lacking the regional idioms and grammatical shortcuts that native speakers unconsciously use. The decision to arrest Dmitry came in March 1985, not because the FBI had definitive proof of espionage, but because they had accumulated enough circumstantial evidence to justify detention and interrogation. They waited until he was alone in his office late one evening, minimizing the risk of a public scene that might alert Soviet intelligence to the investigation. 6 agents entered his office while he was grading papers, identified themselves, and informed him that he was being detained for questioning regarding possible violations of federal espionage statutes. Dmitri's training had prepared him for this moment. He remained calm, asked for an attorney, and volunteered nothing. He knew that his legend would withstand initial scrutiny because it had been so carefully constructed. What he didn't know was that the FBI had already been in contact with the KGB through back-channel communications, exploring the possibility of a prisoner exchange. The interrogation that followed was less about breaking Dmitri through pressure and more about gradually presenting evidence that made his position untenable. The FBI showed him surveillance photographs of his dead drop locations, though they couldn't prove what he had been doing there. They presented analysis of his library records, though checking out books wasn't a crime. They brought in handwriting analysts to compare his academic papers with samples of Russian handwriting, looking for unconscious traces of Cyrillic letter formation. After 6 weeks of detention, the FBI made their offer. They knew he was KGB, even if they couldn't prove it conclusively in court. The Soviet Union knew that he had been compromised, even if the full extent of FBI knowledge was unclear. Both sides wanted a clean resolution. The FBI would allow Dmitri to return to the Soviet Union as part of a prisoner exchange, and in return he would provide a limited debriefing about his training methods and operational procedures, information that would help American counterintelligence without compromising any Soviet sources or methods in ways that would violate his oath. Dmitri, or rather Victor, agreed to the exchange. In his final debriefing before returning to Moscow, he spoke about the psychological reality of deep cover work with a candor that surprised his interrogators. He described the erosion of identity, the loneliness of living a permanent lie, the strange grief of leaving behind a life that was fake but had become emotionally real in some ways. He talked about students he had genuinely cared about teaching, colleagues he had actually liked, moments when he had forgotten he was performing and simply existed as Professor Volkov, discussing ideas he found interesting. He admitted that returning to the Soviet Union felt less like going home and more like being deployed to yet another foreign assignment. Because after 12 years of being Dmitri, Victor was almost as much of a stranger to him as anyone else. The prisoner exchange took place in June 1985 at a checkpoint between East and West Berlin, one of the last classic Cold War spy swaps before the Soviet Union began its collapse. Viktor Petrov walked across the border into East Germany, where KGB officers were waiting to debrief him and evaluate whether his compromise had damaged other operations. He was welcomed as a hero who had served faithfully under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, awarded medals in closed ceremonies, and then quietly retired from active intelligence work. The official story was that his health had suffered during detention, making him unsuitable for further deployment. The reality was that the KGB recognized what the operation had cost him psychologically and understood that he could never be fully trusted to maintain another deep cover identity after having been broken once. Victor spent his remaining years living in a KGB provided apartment in Moscow, working as a translator and occasionally lecturing at intelligence training facilities about the psychological challenges of illegal work. He never married, never formed close relationships, seemed to exist in a permanent state of detachment from whatever life he was inhabiting. Students who attended his lectures remembered him as knowledgeable but distant, someone who could describe the mechanics of deep cover work with technical precision, but who seemed uncomfortable discussing the human experience of it. He died in 2003, 60 years after being born as Viktor Petrov, 43 years after becoming Dmitry Volkov, 18 years after ceasing to be anyone in particular. His death was not reported in any newspaper. There was no obituary, no public acknowledgement of his service to the Soviet state. He simply stopped existing, which in a way had been happening gradually since the day he first stepped into School 101 and began the process of becoming someone else. The story of Viktor Petrov reveals something fundamental about intelligence work that popular culture consistently misunderstands. The dramatic moments, the dead drops, and surveillance and interrogations, those are actually the easy parts because they have clear procedures and defined objectives. The truly devastating aspect of deep cover work is the existential cost of living a comprehensive lie for years or decades. It's the slow realization that the identity you're performing has become more real to the people around you than your actual self, that the friendships you've cultivated instrumentally have generated genuine emotions that can never be reciprocated honestly, that you've spent the prime years of your life building a persona that will be discarded the moment it's no longer operationally useful. Intelligence agencies can train someone to resist interrogation, to service dead drops, to recruit sources. What they can't train someone for is the psychological aftermath of having successfully disappeared into a false identity so completely that your real self becomes irretrievable. This wasn't an anomaly or an extreme case. During the Cold War, both the KGB and the CIA ran dozens of similar operations, planting illegals in enemy societies with instructions to build cover identities and wait for activation that might never come. Some were discovered and arrested. Some successfully exfiltrated after completing their missions. And some simply lived out their entire cover lives and died without ever being activated or exposed, taking their true identities to graves marked with names that were never really theirs. The bureaucratic files that documented these operations are matter-of-fact in their descriptions, treating human identity as just another operational resource to be deployed and expended as needed. There are cables discussing whether an illegal's legend should include a failed marriage or a chronic illness, debating these details with the same detached professionalism that other documents use to discuss equipment specifications or budget allocations. The contemporary implications of this history extend beyond Cold War nostalgia. Deep cover intelligence operations continue today, adapted to modern surveillance technologies and social media verification, but following the same fundamental principles. The techniques that Victor learned at School 101 are still taught at intelligence facilities around the world, refined and updated but essentially unchanged. The psychological challenges he faced remain unsolved because they derive not from insufficient training but from the inherent impossibility of living as someone else without losing yourself in the process. Modern intelligence agencies have better psychiatric support and more sophisticated screening to identify candidates who can withstand the psychological strain. But they cannot eliminate that strain without fundamentally changing the nature of deep cover work. What makes Victor's story particularly significant is that it represents the perfect execution of an intelligence operation that still ultimately failed in its strategic purpose. He successfully maintained his cover for 12 years, gathered valuable intelligence, avoided detection through exceptional tradecraft. But the information he provided, while tactically useful, didn't change the outcome of the Cold War or shift the balance of power between the superpowers. The Soviet Union collapsed not because it lacked intelligence about American academic culture or defense contractor procedures, but because its economic and political system was fundamentally unsustainable. Victor's sacrifice, the 12 years of his life spent being someone else, the psychological damage that left him unable to be fully anyone for the rest of his days, all of it was in service of a cause that was already losing by the time he was arrested. This is perhaps the cruelest reality of intelligence work, that the individual costs are immediate and personal, while the strategic benefits are diffuse and often irrelevant to the broader forces that actually determine historical outcomes. If you made it this far, it's because you understand that the real stories of intelligence work are far more complex and troubling than the sanitized versions we usually get. You recognize that behind every spy thriller and patriotic narrative, there are human beings whose lives were instrumentalized by state machinery that treated identity and loyalty as expendable resources. I created this channel for people who want to understand how power actually operates, not through dramatic confrontations, but through the slow grinding machinery of bureaucratic systems that can destroy people with the same indifferent efficiency they use to process paperwork. Here you'll find investigations into operations that were deliberately buried, analysis of how intelligence agencies shaped events most people never knew were influenced, and honest examinations of what these systems cost the individuals trapped inside them. Subscribe and hit the notification bell, because every week I bring you stories that challenge the comfortable narratives about how governments operate and why. This isn't just entertainment, it's documentation of realities that powerful institutions would prefer remained hidden. The like helps the algorithm show this content to others who deserve to know these truths. Come be part of a community that refuses to accept official versions of events without questioning what's being left out. Until the next revelation,